He did a little bit of everything, expanding his musical horizons to include both world music and unusual tunings. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Lou Harrison. Lou Harrison was born in May 1917 in Portland, Oregon. His mother was one of many West Coasters to be taken in by all things Eastern and passed this love onto her son. She came from such a wealthy background that she managed to get music lessons while growing up in the Alaskan wilderness in the 1890s. Lou's nickname was Buster, and he had a knack for the theatrical. In a 1920 production of the play Daddy Longlegs, he was cast in a silent role, but he improvised some lines and won the hearts of the audience. After a bad investment, the Harrisons moved south to California, one of about 30 moves that they'd come to make. Without school stability, Lou had few friends, and he wasn't close to his brother Bill either. His parents' relationship was bitter and contentious and dominated by his mother, who blamed her bookworm husband for their bad luck. To cope, Lou dove into music, writing his first composition when he was 10. When the Harrisons moved to Berkeley, Lou got some lessons in jazz piano in Oakland, and he augmented his singing skills, both as a soprano and bass for a while, with a more theoretical underpinning of what he was doing, as well as picking up little bits of the organ, harpsichord, horn, clarinet, and recorder. His piano teacher was encouraging of his compositions, and while they're nothing to write home about, they show a composer who is really comfortable imitating classical forms. Further study got him into medieval and Renaissance music, as well as Chinese opera, which he frequented in San Francisco. He developed a library addiction of reading several books a day, a habit that would last pretty much for the rest of his life, and he also wrote a lot of poetry. Harrison escaped his home life by moving in with friends who all attended San Francisco State University, and while SFSU did not have a music major, it did have a music department, and it had one of America's few early music ensembles. Prior to the revival of historically informed performance practice when it came to Baroque music and before later in the century, these ensembles were few and far between, and this introduced Harrison to non-equal temperament, tunings where not all half-steps are created equal. His pieces were informed by pre-classical forms and instrumentations, specifically Tudor-era English music. This is also where he first heard recordings of gamelan music. More on that later. But how to include these sounds in his music? Well, he discovered the work of Henry Cowell, whose avant-garde piano recitals took him around the country, smashing his palms on the keyboard to create tone clusters and reaching inside the piano to play directly on the strings. Cowell was the editor of the quarterly publication New Music, which published the music of and was underwritten by Charles Ives. Importantly, Cowell chronicled his experiments in a book called New Musical Resources. This was the lightning bolt that ignited the wildfire of Harrison's experimentation. Harrison met Cowell in 1935, and when he couldn't pay the tuition to take Cowell's class and UC's extension system, Cowell functionally waived the tuition by making Harrison his in-class assistant. Harrison loved tinkering with percussion, and he often made his own percussion instruments out of found objects, and thus found a home in the avant-garde. Cowell had written for percussion ensemble, as had Edgar Varèse and a smattering of Russian futurists. In 1935, Harrison wrote his first major percussion piece, Waterfront 1934, about the previous July's outbreak of violence between dock workers and the police. This dramatized the strike and was intended to promote class consciousness and mark the beginning of Harrison's prolific career in writing for dance. Right as Harrison's career was starting to progress, his mentor Cowell was arrested under some controversial circumstances. The exact nature of what he did or didn't do, and if it even should have been illegal in the first place, largely depends on whose account you read. But at the end of the day, his arrest and eventual incarceration in San Quentin was for something that Harrison or many in his circle could have easily been charged with. This spooked Harrison, but he was undaunted and began a correspondence directly with Ives, who had cut off contact with Cowell during his imprisonment. Ives' music was not performed very often, if at all. Almost all of his major pieces were awaiting their first performances, and when Harrison told Ives that there was an opportunity to perform some of his pieces, Ives sent him a crate of his music, 117 songs, 11 volumes of chamber music, his piano sonatas, and his third symphony, something that could have easily cost him over $1,000 to get copied, because copying was not cheap back then. Harrison visited Cowell for lessons while Cowell was still in San Quentin, and Cowell assigned him 3 or 4 note melodic snippets for Harrison to work on. And Harrison developed these by transposing them and inverting them and otherwise messing with them, but not developing them linearly in like the Germanic sense, where you have a development section of a sonata or a symphony. By working in small segments, he created unified sections without the need for exact repetition. These cells provided an underlying but not totally obvious sense of unity. He called these melodicals, and their rhythmic equivalent rhythmicals. This worked for him because he always worked his music out melodically first, making sure it worked on the linear end of things without worrying about long-term harmonic goals or progressions. This cubist approach had its roots in the medieval isorhythmic motet, where composers would set up a pattern of durations and a pattern of pitches and set them off against one another such that they only occasionally lined up. When Cowell showed him Schoenberg's 12-tone technique, then relatively unknown in the United States, Harrison immediately recognized it as composition with a single melodical, i.e. the prime form tone row. Both composers agreed that Schoenberg's technique had inherent limitations, so in order to compensate for this, Harrison turned to the theories of Carl Ruggles, a rugged modernist who systematically avoided pitch repetition, as well as those of Cowell's teacher, Charles Seeger, whose dissonant counterpoint inverted the traditional rules of that art. By synthesizing these techniques, Harrison came up with interval controls, where before a composition was started, he picked the few intervals that he would allow in his melodies, an outgrowth of his use of melodicals. In doing so, Harrison generated a unique sound world for each piece, guaranteed compositional unity, and could write incredibly quickly. This productivity and adaptability was a key feature in Harrison's dance writing career, where he would have to adjust his scores on the fly for who and what was available. If a dancer could read music and wasn't on a stage for the particular number, they could come down and play an instrument. Likewise, if a dancer came up injured before a number, Harrison or one of the musicians would go up there and perform choreography. He even learned Leba notation, a system designed for notating dance, so he could make sure his music worked in counterpoint to the movement. In May 1938, John Cage showed up at Harrison's door, having been sent by Cowell, and the two hit it off. Cage was looking for a job in the modern dance world, and Cowell knew of Harrison's many connections. Cage was a fellow lover of found percussion, adored Schoenberg, with whom he'd studied about half a decade prior, and it was through Harrison's connections that he would meet his longtime collaborator and partner Merce Cunningham. It was in part due to Cage's influence that Harrison moved away from just an emphasis on percussion towards writing all percussion works. He theorized that music was evolving away from traditional melodies and harmonies towards composition that embraced the full spectrum of sound, with percussion ensembles acting as an intermediate step towards this goal, very similar to the theories put forward by Edgard Varèse. But Harrison's music and Varèse's music were two different beasts entirely. When Varèse got a copy of Harrison's Symphony No. 13 for percussion ensemble, Varèse wrote back and told Harrison never to use his term organized sound to refer to Harrison's music, because their music was just too dissimilar, even though they had the same underlying theory about the nature of the percussion ensemble, and both really loved percussion. While the musical establishment was working towards ever more daring branches of complexity, Harrison was content with simplicity. He didn't want the acceptance of the academic mainstream. Though he taught at Oakland's Mills College in the late 30s and early 40s, he got so fed up by the exhausting nature of his Cross Bay commute that he quit in 1941 in favor of working as a flower arranger in San Francisco's Palace Hotel. Adjunct positions never change. Boy, if that's a glimpse into my future, I'm gonna need a drink. I just hate flowers so much! The 1940s were a time of great change. Harrison got his first orchestral performance, Cage moved east, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which drove many West Coast cities to panic. Friends who taught him Japanese music were shipped off to internment camps, despite Harrison's best efforts to hide them. Though horrified at the atrocities, Harrison was not one to fight. He was unafraid of being openly countercultural, supporting pacifist movements when such ideas were downright unpopular in the United States, as well as being openly gay. Living in San Francisco meant that he never had to worry as much about hiding his orientation in social circles. According to ethnomusicologist Sidney Robertson, the attitude of artists in the city at the time was one of such radical individualism that if you didn't blaze your own trail, something was wrong with you. That is, in Harrison's circles, being openly gay was like the least interesting thing about the people who came to his parties. And it was his orientation that classified him as 4F, i.e. unfit for military service, when the draft board letter inevitably came. Musically, Harrison was stuck. His percussion writing advanced so much that it had nowhere to go. Composer-led ensemble collectives, as Harrison and Cage had tried to pioneer, wouldn't be a replicable model for another couple of decades. There were no non-Western ensembles to write for, and many of his scores languished with one performance at best. To change his fortunes, Harrison left his percussion instruments in the home of his largely disinterested parents and moved south to LA, where he almost got run over by Bob Hope. There he met Aaron Copland and sought a job at UCLA, where Arnold Schoenberg was teaching, with the thinking that the staff position there would grant him access to Schoenberg's class, and indeed it did. Schoenberg evaluated Harrison's pieces on their own terms, irrespective of style. Contrary to popular belief, Schoenberg didn't want his students to write like him because he didn't want to produce copycat composers. But Harrison, unafraid, took in a 12-tone piece, and thinking that Schoenberg was going to kick him out of his class, Schoenberg turned around and said it was good and that he liked it, and helped Harrison fix the place where he got stuck. Schoenberg craved clarity and simplicity, things that he felt his own music lacked. And later on, when Harrison got stumped, he would always return to the same question. How can I simplify this? How can I distill this? How can I make this more clear? Harrison had a complex relationship with serialism, and often adapted it to suit his needs for a given piece, such as in his Symphony on G. Harrison moved to New York in the summer of 1943, following many of his friends who had already gone to the Big Apple. But he found the city just too cramped, too hot, and much too noisy for his liking. Although he was able to reconnect with Cowell and Cage, Cowell having been since released from San Quentin, the depressing environment, a breakup, the marriage of his brother, and the death of an old lover culminated in a half-baked suicide attempt. Eventually he settled down in Greenwich Village, the now gentrified famous home of artists near Cage, Cowell, and Elliott Carter. And Varese wasn't too far away either. Because he couldn't play the piano late at night, Harrison built an updated version of the Baroque clavichord, an instrument generally just used for practice purposes. For the rest of his life, he could only ever compose in solitude. In 1946, Harrison conducted the New York Little Symphony in a program that included the Third Symphony of Charles Ives, which would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize. Harrison was so laser-focused on giving Ives the credit he was long overdue that he failed to allocate enough rehearsal time to his piece that was on the same program, and so passed up an opportunity to present the best version of his music to a wider audience of New Yorkers. It paid off in a way. Ives was so grateful to Harrison that he gave him half of the Pulitzer Prize money and named him an heir of his estate. But the lack of success in his own music drove him ever deeper into depression, smoking, and drinking, culminating in a nervous breakdown in May 1947. Ives discreetly paid for his almost 9-month stay in the psychiatric hospital. Harrison emerged deeply shaken but always writing. As his mental health improved, his music shifted into ever sparser textures, and he spent time as a faculty member at the experimental Black Mountain College in the North Carolina mountains. But he was intimidated by the presence of avant-garde artists of all fields and felt an increasing distance between himself and Cage. Several years prior, Harrison had shown Cage the I Ching, or Chinese Book of Changes, and now Cage used it to create chants compositions inspired by his Zen Buddhism. Harrison's duties at Black Mountain increased until he was basically the entire music department, at which point he was given a Guggenheim Fellowship. So he spent the year off writing his dream project, what would be his last 12-tone piece, the opera Rapunzel. Rapunzel was inspired by Alban Berg and his violin concerto, specifically how Berg was able to fuse the 12-tone technique with tonality. And many critics, while they criticized Rapunzel's lack of true narrative drive, thought that Harrison's use of the 12-tone technique to create lyricism was quite commendable. To take Harrison's place at Black Mountain, they hired Stefan Volpa, a Webern disciple whose rigorous academic music was more in keeping with the rest of the faculty. And then they kept Volpa instead of rehiring Harrison, so Harrison was forced to go back to New York. But in New York, he was burned out. Not only was it bad for his mental health, but he was sick of writing for dance, and he didn't want to do any more concert reviews, and those were the only two things that ever kept him afloat in New York in the first place. So, in the summer of 1953, Harrison moved back to California, eventually settling in the village of Aptos, where he dove into microtonal tuning systems. He was particularly inspired by the music of Harry Partch, who built 43-tone instruments derived from the principles of just intonation, where the tones of a scale or chord are derived from pure harmonic ratios. For Harrison, an equally tempered 12 tones led inevitably to the 12-tone technique because, unless you were talking about the octave, everything on a modern keyboard is a little bit out of tune. He compared it to how industrialization standardized everything at the expense of the work of master craftsmen. The beauty of just intonation was that explorations of the overtone series generated intervals that sound exotic to Western ears, accustomed to equal temperament, but are actually more consonant than some of the most common consonances that we find on the piano, like the wildly out-of-tune thirds. When the Louisville Symphony commissioned a piece, his Strict Songs, Harrison used this as an opportunity to flex these new theoretical muscles. He built pentatonic scales out of these pure ratios, meaning that the scales of the songs differ wildly from the pentatonic scale that you would find on a piano, which would be just the black keys. This is where his interest in gamelan music somewhat resurfaced, as detuned pentatonic scales is the absolute basic layman's version of what a lot of gamelan music sounds like. Even when composing for exclusively Western instruments, he began grouping instruments like the harp, the celeste, the vibraphone, and a certain kind of prepared piano called a tack piano into a section that he called the gamelan section. Performability, especially on keyboard instruments, was a major concern for most microtonal composers, which led to many different solutions. Partch invented his own instruments, while European modernists often commissioned others. But a truly good string quartet, Harrison noted, could change their tunings on the fly to fit with whatever harmony existed. It sure might not be exactly just intonation, but it was far closer to that than it was to equal temperament. For Partch, freely notating the ratios that differentiated one note from the previous was too complex to even consider, but considerate Harrison did. In 1955's Symphony in Free Style, he does just that. Every note was assigned a particular ratio vis-a-vis the previous note. It was, for all practical purposes, completely unperformable. Players would need anywhere from 4 to 19 different versions of their instrument in order to get all the tones that Harrison notated. This piece sat until 1992, when it was electronically realized. Most commonly, Harrison would use just intonation principles to create a fixed scale, and then exploit the unique properties of the scale he made. For Harrison, music was the mathematics of emotions, and just intonation was the key to unlocking those emotions. Gradually, the musical world was paying more and more attention to this fresh voice, but Harrison was so put off by his experiences on the East Coast that he turned down a lucrative residency at the University at Buffalo. But he did go to Asia, attending a conference of world music in Tokyo, and thereafter spending some time in Seoul until his visa ran out in July 1961. He shipped a crate of Korean instruments back to California, and soon thereafter began composing for those instruments, and then building his own. A stint in Hawaii led him to compose one of his true masterpieces, Pacific Rounds, which combines the instruments of East and West. He was an environmentalist at heart who was so concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons that he wrote a letter to the IRS saying that he no longer owed his taxes because the government had broken the social contract. When IRS agents showed up, he relished in the opportunity to debate them for 3 straight hours, after which the IRS agent said, "Oh, you might have a point, but if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get arrested." He wasn't just anti-nuclear because he was a pacifist. He was anti-nuclear on a more personal level because he got a Geiger counter and proved that there was radiation leaking across the Sierra Nevada mountain range from all the nuclear tests that the US government was conducting in the next state over. He also turned this Geiger counter into an instrument by amplifying it. Harrison's later use of the 12-tone technique and of equal temperament was generally to express something horrible, like, a nuclear apocalypse. When the protests of the 1960s came about, he used music as a tool for social change, writing pieces that explicitly called for peace. As Harrison amassed an ever larger collection of non-Western instruments, he began tinkering with building his own. Together with his partner Bill Kolvig, a retired electrician, they suspended metal bars over welded together aluminum cans or gas canisters, similar to the construction of many gamelan instruments, and so they called it an American gamelan, with their first effort called Old Grandad. It only superficially resembled Indonesian instruments, as it was tuned to a scale derived by Ptolemy. Harrison didn't know anything about gamelan theory, and so he began studying the Javanese style with Kanjeng Raden Tumenggung Wasitodipuro, or Pak Cokro, who taught him its nuances and suggested in 1975 that Harrison write for Javanese gamelan instead of just his own ensemble. Harrison wrangled the uncooperative administration of San Jose State, where he was teaching, into buying a small gamelan of their own, and so he began writing pieces that combined Western and Javanese instruments. But this proved too popular. The ensemble was too small. It only accommodated about 8 people, which is equivalent of a chamber group, and San Jose State didn't want to pony up the money to buy a full-scale gamelan from Java. With Pak Cokro's blessing, Harrison and Kolvig constructed a full-scale Javanese gamelan with aluminum as the primary metal instead of bronze. They then constructed 2 more during Harrison's 1-year appointment back at Mills College. These American-built gamelan ensembles were typically tuned to just intonation, something that was theoretically possible in the Javanese style, but not entirely likely, and entirely foreign to what the Balinese would play. Approaching retirement age, Harrison reinvented himself as a gamelan composer, although he could be occasionally enticed to write for orchestra, such as his piano concerto written for Keith Jarrett. Harrison and Jarrett both realized the impracticality of requiring multiple pianos for multiple just intonation systems, so Harrison compromised by selecting a temperament called Kernberger No. 2, because it was invented by a J.S. Bach pupil named Johann Kernberger. This tuning is well-tempered in that it creates a circle of fifths, but also tries to keep as many pure intervals in the system as possible, leading to the shades of color between different keys that composers of the Baroque and before so greatly prized. While the piece was a smash hit, Harrison never got paid for it, as he and Jarrett never signed a contract. Harrison always enjoyed making music for friends more than writing pieces for other performers to play, and this incident doubled his resolve to write more for his friends. So he followed up the piano concerto with his Concerto for Piano and Javanese Gamelan, a tour de force of combining East and West. His philosophy was one of reconciliation between styles. Although he loved Javanese gamelan more than any other type of music, he wasn't going to artificially cordon off different sections of world music and deem them never to overlap. Javanese and Balinese musicians have always been open to Westerners exploring their music and their culture so long as they approach it with a certain degree of reverence and respect. Harrison noted that it was only Americans who ever got upset or offended on behalf of the Indonesians for Harrison's use of Indonesian instruments and styles in his music.
I don't think you have to be born in Kyoto to play the koto, for example, or in Benares to play the sitar. I think that you can burn off your cultural armor if you are greedy enough. And of course, I think that the 2 noble virtues, if combined with courtesy, are lust and greed. And if you want to sing like someone, like an Indian, or like an Indonesian or a Chinese, or whatever, if you want to badly enough, you can do it, because we're all human beings. And I think it is this love of other things, this greed, that is important, brings us together.
Pinning down Harrison's music to one thing is difficult and ultimately pointless. He worked in so many different styles and used so many different techniques that no definitive statement can possibly be made. Even if we grant that he went through distinct musical periods, he still used earlier music in his later music, freely borrowing from different eras of his own compositional lifetime, and he could write two different pieces in two different styles at the same time depending on what a commission dictated. While he somewhat controversially considered just intonation to be a musical universal, that is, because it's based on certain objectively true mathematical properties, it's something with which all musical cultures contended, he wasn't always fond of world music just because it came from another culture. He especially didn't like Thai music because he thought that it was too equally tempered. They used 7-tone equal temperament instead of 12-tone equal temperament, but it was the equal temperament part that got him, not the number of tones in the scale. Because of his upbringing, surrounded by Asian artifacts, courtesy of his mother, his interest in Asian music has been analyzed in part as his desire to recapture a certain childlike innocence. Generally, Harrison chose a set of limiting principles, unique to each piece, and rarely, if ever, discussed what these limiting principles were. As he got older, he continued to accept commissions. Having experienced poverty, he found it impossible to say no. He compared the process of commissioning him to taking a number and getting in line. Also, medical bills were piling up. Not for him so much, even though he'd just undergone open heart surgery, but rather for Bill Kolvig, who was experiencing memory and hearing loss. For their health's sake, they decided to move from the damp home in Aptos to the desert of Joshua Tree into a house of Harrison's own design, inspired by, what else, the ratios of just intonation. But they battled the authorities on getting this project done. In the authorities' defense, they wanted the house to be built out of packed straw, and I'm sure the authorities remembered the story of the three little pigs. While Harrison was dealing with tremors and trigeminal neuralgia, Kolvig suffered a series of falls, probably instigated by a series of strokes, and after a cancer diagnosis, passed away in 2000. 3 years later, Harrison was invited to attend a festival of his music to be held at the Ohio State University. And he hated flying, so he went by train and car, and this proved so grueling that he just didn't make it. He died in a Denny's bathroom in Lafayette, Indiana, at the age of 85. If any composer can be said to have been a true world citizen, it was Harrison. He was enthusiastic about the entire pantheon of human culture, from their history and religious practices to their architecture to their food. He had but one culinary vice, which he and Kolvig called thousand-year soup, into which all leftovers, water and hot peppers would be thrown, and it would be simmering on the stove for literally years. They'd never throw it out, and it eventually distilled down into this purplish goop. He had rooms dedicated to Alves, a man after my own heart, and Tchaikovsky. Visitors to the Tchaikovsky room would be concerned because it was just the bathroom. They thought, why is this called the Tchaikovsky room? But then they would close the door and see on the back of the door a full-length naked portrait of Tchaikovsky painted by Harrison himself. As a composition teacher, Harrison followed in the footsteps of Schoenberg, encouraging his students to explore everything and passing on the tips and tricks that he found over his many years of experience. He said that while he was inspired by world music of all stripes, he chose what he included in a piece on a piece-by-piece basis. He didn't throw everything in a blender. Harrison often waited until he completed a composition to add bar lines to it, preferring to rid himself from convention and let his music flow. Even then, the bar lines would often be between the bars, as you see in many modern editions of medieval and Renaissance scores. He loved the viola, was an expert in calligraphy, was immune to motion sickness, and when in New York, was mistaken for Orson Welles so often that he gave up and signed autographs in Welles' name. His life in music is a testament to a limitless inspiration and a boundless creativity, leaving us with so many different pieces in so many different styles, but all distinctly his own.